entirely sure why I started this series, but as it's evolved, I guess I've come to hope it'll be of interest to theatre goers in general, but in particular to my fellow playwrights and to my fellow academics. And those two audiences come apart a little bit in terms of David Eldridge, because I don't think I need to tell my fellow playwrights how good a playwright David Eldridge is. He's very, very widely admired for the integrity, the emotional richness, the unflinching sympathy of his plays, as well as for his advocacy of playwriting in general. He was a key member of both the Monsterists and the Antelopes. Look them up, two very influential 21st century playwright kind of lobbying groups, I suppose. I think most playwrights would recognize him as one of the key writers of our time. But he's not a playwright that has greatly troubled theatre academics. There are some exceptions. There are a few articles and chapters by Graham Saunders, Sarah Gahala, David Mentor, Peter Thompson. But when we, as theatre academics, write about 21st century theatre, I think Eldridge gets a little bit overlooked. And let me say immediately that I include myself in this accusation, despite my genuinely deep love of his work. I've not written academically about his plays either, and I've been asking myself why. And this is kind of what I think. In part, it may be because academics tend to get drawn to plays that require scholars, or seem to require scholars, to intervene, to interpret and explain them. You know, the playfulness of Tim Crouch, the kind of cryptic riddles of Martin Crimp, the linguistic density of Debbie Tucker Green, or the kind of formal innovations of Carol Churchill, they all seem to invite explanation and clarification and analysis of some kind. But David Eldridge's plays, on the whole, don't work that way. In general, they are crystal clear. They're extremely accessible. They're set among recognizable people in recognizable environments. His plays are often, in fact, somewhat naturalistic. As soon as I say that, of course, there are huge exceptions. Market Boy from 2006 was a pageant play for the National Theatre. The previous year, 2005, Incomplete and Random Acts of Kindness at the Royal Court has a splintered and jumbled chronological structure. And much more recently, in 2014, Holy Warriors at Shakespeare's Globe describes itself as a fantasia, and it tells a 1,000-year history of disastrous Western adventurism in the Middle East. But those huge exceptions to one side, and probably some others too, his plays are generally somewhat naturalistic, lifelike representations, closely observed, of extraordinary, ordinary life. Pertinent to that, his versions of Ibsen and Strindberg are among the best that I've seen. His version of The Wild Duck, which Michael Grandage directed at the Donmar in 2005, is sublime in finding the terrible laughter in that play at the stupidities that lead it to its chokingly tragic end. And he did a Miss Julie for the Royal Exchange in 2012, which is clear, claustrophobic, and ferocious, just as that play needs to be. In fact, in Basildon, has a kind of very recognizable Chekhovian 4-act structure, and uses that structure to completely persuasive effect. But it means that his plays, on the face of it, seem to require no explanation or interpretation. They seem luminously transparent. Basically, they don't need us as academics. if they require any explanation, it's perhaps of a type at which academia is a bit out of practice. The careful technical exposition of how that luminous transparency is created, the kind of detailed way in which he creates this vivid, rich, immediate sense of reality. Related to that, David Eldridge's plays don't generally address politics directly. I mean, having said that, Holy Warriors, Market Boy, and various others do, in fact. But even the plays that don't they do implicitly, in Basildon, for example, kind of took seriously the white working class Essex man, long before that became an identity that obsessed the political classes. A wonderful play of his called The Stock de War from 2011, which was done downstairs at Hampstead. I'm not sure if Hampstead have still been doing that, but they used to do plays downstairs without inviting any of the critics. So it's not a particularly well-known play, but it sort of elliptically addressed British guilt and Islamist terrorism in various ways. But their politics, if politics is even the word, lie not in a sort of critical analysis of policy or a sort of or kind of social issues. They lie in a kind of deeply humane commitment to people, I think, to their aspirations, their dignity, their personal pain. Trying to think of a good example of that. I mean, I think probably the best example of that is his most recent play, 2017's Beginning at the National, which initially comes on like a fantastic sitcom episode, but by the end has become a devastatingly moving and heartfelt expression of our need for and fear of love. His early masterpiece, and I do think it's a masterpiece, Under the Blue Sky, 2000, brings together three only passingly connected long scenes, almost playlets in themselves, but the whole sequence takes us through the deepest emotional cruelty, but finally to a ravishing sense of redemption. Another particular favorite of mine is 2011's The Knot of the Heart at the Almeida, which is an extraordinary journey to hell and back in the story of a minor TV celebrity and her descent into heroin addiction and her slow, painful, quite public crawl back to serene cleanliness, I suppose. What unites all of these plays, though, I think, is the profound truthfulness of how Eldridge sees his characters, and I would say his complete imaginative devotion to them. And the third reason I think academics don't know what to do with his work is that his subject is feeling and emotion. I mean, it's not just that, but there's no playwright in Britain alive who writes better, more scorchingly, more heartbreakingly, more upliftingly about emotion. And it's wrong to say he writes about emotion. He doesn't. It is emotion, his work. He conjures the deepest feelings on stage. And I think kind of academics tend to be a bit cool about emotion. Emotion in plays is maybe a kind of a trick. Maybe it's sentimental or melodramatic. Perhaps all of that emotion betrays a kind of psychological individualism that may be suspiciously conservative. I think probably we have a kind of post-Brechtian sensibility that sees emotion on stage as something to be suspicious of or to be deprecated in favor of politics or analysis or intervention or a broader social vision. But Eldridge is never sentimental, I think, not for a second, unless he's unsentimentally observing sentiment. I think of there's a scene in Basildon where they sing "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles," the West Ham song, and of course it's a sentimental moment, but it's for the characters, but not sentimental in the play. And also, I think it's important to say that generating emotion on stage isn't a trick. It's difficult and it requires technical command. But when it's combined with the empathy and clear-sightedness of someone like David Eldridge, there's nothing cheap or insincere about it. And also, emotion needs to be part of any social vision. David's plays, I think, precisely because of their naturalism, are always located in a rich sense of their worlds, and the emotions are too. In Basildon, which I just mentioned, the emotions kind of, for the first 3 acts, rumble very deep. You can see this sort of real sense of resentment and these kind of cracks in the family unit. There are these kind of long buried feelings of disappointment and betrayal. And in the brilliantly subtle final scene, which is actually a flashback, it takes place earlier than any of the other scenes, we finally understand the reason for those deep resentments in a wonderful scene where a very important promise is made explicitly and then tacitly, without a word being spoken, is kind of unmade before our eyes. And so we understand the feelings of that play in the context of money and class and inequality, and how those feelings are a way of negotiating those fault lines. David has always written brilliantly about class. From the first play of his that I ever saw, Serving It Up, in 1996 at the old Bush Theatre, which was above a pub, and it was a claustrophobic space in which this play of laddishness and bigotry and sex and drink and violence felt absolutely explosive. I will never forget Eddie Marsan as Sonny giving one of the most wired and dangerous and kind of unpredictable performances that I've ever seen. So all of that to say, David Eldridge is a playwright of extraordinary power and maturity, one of the greatest writers we have at the moment, writing plays that require subtlety, honesty, empathy and kindness. I really think he is extraordinary, and I can't wait to talk to him about his work. So David, hello, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right. Yeah. Just jogging along in the lockdown.
Yeah. What's your experience of lockdown then?
So it's sort of just like a lot of childcare is the first thing to say, because our youngest son Wilf is just 1, so I'm tending to do the mornings and a kind of slightly longer morning, and then my partner Caro does the afternoon and I work in the afternoon, but she doesn't work on a Friday, so I tend to make up for the longer mornings I do Monday to Thursday by having a longer work day on Friday when she does most of the care of Wilf, and we're just swapping it, and we're tired just because of looking after our son and then trying to work in a very focused way where we can in the time that we've got. And then like we clean the flat on a Saturday and look forward to a Deliveroo on a Saturday evening. It's like kind of lockdown reality, it's a bit mad.
Yeah. A lot of this is very recognizable to me, I will say.
Yeah, but like, I mean, we're really quite tired, but we've kind of like you know, we've been watching, like we watched the first season of Bass Boot
Oh yeah.
at the start of the lockdown, which we really enjoyed, and yeah, kind of reading a bit, you know, which is good. I read David Land's memoir, which was lovely,
Yeah.
and just really enjoying Lem Sisay's memoir, My Name Is Why, which I've just started. So just trying to sort of keep going in a kind of measured way, and not get too scared about anything, and just try and work and have a bit of a routine and keep sane like everyone else, I guess, you know.
Yeah. Some people I've spoken to have kind of admitted that certainly for the first couple of weeks they found it quite hard to focus. Have you found any of that, or actually did you sort of change gear quite quickly?
I was the opposite of that, actually. I mean, this is absolutely true. I'm not sort of being a contrarian. Like the first, I remember the week before we went into lockdown, feeling quite depressed because I knew what was going to happen, and I thought, like, why aren't the government doing this now? Like, I can see what's happening in Italy and Spain here on the news, and I felt quite like depressed and down that week, and that week was really hard to work. But then when when Caro started working from home, and then when we were getting into the nursery closing and lockdown proper and all of that, I don't know, like I kind of clicked into it. I kind of was finishing an adaptation of a novel. Well, I've been writing a play from a novel,
Hmm.
which I'm told by the producers that I can't talk about, even though I think it's it's maybe, you know, what, you know, it's life in the West End. You know, when that will happen, you
Mm.
know, is obviously very uncertain now, but they still won't want me to talk about it, which is fair enough. But I was finishing that, and that was really good, having the focus of that, and then you know, that was really good, and then kind of in the last couple of weeks I've lost some of that focus a bit, and I think it's getting a big job finished on the end of the lockdown,
Mm.
and the TV work that I'm doing at the moment is a bit more bitty. You know, I've got a kind of a rebrief on a pilot of a TV show that I was working really well on, but I've struggled a bit on in the last week or so, and there are two TV shows that are much earlier stage of development, which it just feels a little bit more bitty. And I think, like, when you've only got 3 or 4 hours to work in the afternoon,
Mm.
like a big trying to find your focus quickly is quite important.
Yeah.
And if you can't, then it's really hard. So yeah, I struggled a bit in the last couple of weeks, to be honest.
Mm.
Um,
Right.
hopefully I'll get my mojo back at some point. How are you doing?
um, well, I think I did sort of, I was a bit thrown, I think, by the sudden change of life. Obviously, we've got a 3.5-year-old who's at
Yeah.
home, but is loving being at home. He loves the fact he gets lots of his mum and dad all the time, which is kind of lovely. But I guess partly I'm doing this because I wanted something to really focus me. Um,
Yeah.
so there you go. Um, I wanted to ask about. I'm going to ask about kind of in general terms about how you write, being aware that it maybe is not possible to talk in general terms about how you write. But I want to talk about ask you about where your plays come from. And what I mean by that is actually, where do they start? Is there a typical type of thing they start with, like an image or an issue or an experience or a character or something else?
No, there's not really.
Right.
You know, I'm sort of have lost count of how many plays I've written now, but they've all sort of come from slightly different starting points. You know, sometimes the impetus is to write for an actor. So the Knot of the Heart is a good example of that.
Mhm.
You know, Holy Warriors was wanting to write for a particular theatre space. You
Yeah.
know, And I read there were these two terrific new histories of the Crusades that were published around the same time that I read, and I thought, oh yeah, that's the kind of story that I want to tell in the Globe Theatre, you know. So that came out of a space really. You know, sometimes ideas knock around for a long time.
Mm.
Uh, so in Basildon would be a good example of that, and so with Beginning. But within Basildon, it was kind of wanting to write about a sense of place. With Beginning, it was kind of the starting point was a funny story that happened to a mate of mine.
Right.
So it really kind of, you know, like with Incomplete and Random Acts of Kindness, I wanted to kind of try and write a play where the form kind of really described the meaning, you know, where the form was the breakdown, you know, that the character was having, you know, about a man who falls apart and puts himself back together again. So the play almost does that in its form. So I'm afraid it's no sort of convenient, neat answer, but it's just not the truth of it. I would say if there is one common thing that I've noticed over all these years, it's that somehow the way that time works in the play and matching that to the way that I use time when I write the play has been a common thing that's come up again and again and again. So I give some concrete examples of that. So, for example, in Basildon is a play that's in 4 acts. It's a slightly sub-Chekhovian Chekhovian gesture, and I wrote, you know, I kind of roughly kind of planned it out and plotted it through. I had a kind of a sense of roughly what the action of each act was, and I wrote 1 act per week, and there was something really important about that, you know. Whereas Incomplete and Random Acts of Kindness, which is non-linear, a play with quite a long time span. I think the play takes place over a course of a few years.
Yes.
You know, and although I wanted the emotional journey of the character to be absolutely linear, the kind of narrative was kind of out of sequence, and that was a nightmare. That was like, you know, kind of like it was like kind of trying to create a theatrical jigsaw puzzle, and it took 3.5 years, and there was a lot of, you know, trying to come at it in different ways, you know, and if you try and fix this bit, then that bit doesn't work there, and stuff like that, and that was all done in a kind of a strange collage type way over a few years, that play. So I think there's that commonality, I would say. But apart from that, it's hard to nail it down further, I would say.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, because I think of, because actually the way you're going to carve up time on stage is really clearly different in all the plays, and also is, you know, Beginning would be a completely different play if there were kind of time jumps in it.
Yeah.
But it's the fact that we're stuck with those, in the room with those characters, or the fact that Under the Blue Sky has those 3 very, very distinct scenes that without the obvious connections and so on. Is the discovery of what the kind of time structure of the play, is that something that for you is quite early in the process, that so you might kind of think, oh, I think I've unlocked this because I think it's a real-time play? Or is it, might you try plays in different ways in your head and only come at it quite late in the process? Or again, is that different?
No, you're right. It's really important to me, and it's part of the very early thinking about a play, and the form and shape of the play is another way that I describe it in relation to the way that time is used. So, you know, and that goes right back to my first play, Serving It Up. You know, I knew that there were roughly this number of scenes, and it roughly happened over this period of time. You know, when Nick is having an affair with Sonny's mum, and I kind of knew, you know, and I kind of knew that, and it's one of the things that helps me write the plays. Then when I've got that sense of shape, it gives a play definition. It helps define a play, you know.
Yeah.
But I will, you know, I will get rid of it, Dan, you know, if it's not working for me. So for example, a good example of that is the Knot of the Heart. So when I first conceived the Knot of the Heart, I was thinking of like the 12 steps of NA and AA and all that, and kind of sort of writing a play a bit in the 12 in that kind of form of that journey. And I kind of worked it out as 12 scenes, 6 in the first half, 6 in the second half. But then like two things happened as I was writing the play, getting those scenes down, which is firstly, I realized that I was trying to squash too much story into every scene, and the play was feeling like really kind of like compressed. It wasn't taking the time and paced in the right way, the storytelling. And then the second thing was that kind of the story that was emerging was clearly one that wasn't kind of just an ascent. Actually, it was a kind of a descent into hell. I think you described it as in your blog back in the day, which is to her lowest point, which is absolutely correct way of describing it. And then the second half is an ascent into some kind of recovery or possibility of recovery in a place that feels like heaven, you know, on Table Mountain in Cape Town. And so after, I think I'd written about 4 or 5 scenes at the first half when I realised that was what was going on, and I had to stop and sort of not completely start again, but mostly start again. You know, it wasn't all thrown away what I'd done, but and then it was funny the way I wrote it because it fitted in with my life at the time. I then wrote that first half of the Knot of the Heart over about 6 weeks or something like that. And you know, there were 7 scenes in that, in each half of the Knot of the Heart. And then I moved from Walthamstow to rural Lancashire with my ex-wife, and obviously that was a massive move. And I didn't write anything for a month. And if you remember, the in the interval of the Knot of the Heart, a year passes.
That's
So
right.
having this month off of the play while I moved house was really great. And then I revised the first half and then wrote the second half in about 5 or 6 weeks as well.
Right.
So again, that thing of the time scale fitting in somehow with the shape of the play and the form of the play and the story, and it all helping me is something that's really important there.
And so if you say that, you know, sort of making those decisions, even if they're revisable, about the sort of the time, the shape of the play in terms of its time is a relatively early process. What are you doing in between that and the point you actually kind of start writing like dialogue and stuff? Do you do research? Do you keep a notebook? Are you doing other things?
Yeah, I'm doing research depending upon what it is, and that might be my own sort of homework on like what you know, because it's particularly important to me to get a job right. If a character, you know, is doing a job or comes from a particular place, or there's a particular kind of history in a character or a family. So there's not just the research of kind of reading books kind. There's also just the kind of work. There's the kind of spade work of
Yeah.
making sure that I know what I need to know about a character or a family in a play or a person's job or whatever. I can also be doing a lot of well, Robert Holman calls this doodling, and I didn't really know what he meant by that to begin with. And now, after all these years, I really do know what that means, which is that there's almost a part where, well, I think years ago, Dan, I really thought I was starting the play, and it'd be really frustrating because I couldn't write it. Because
Okay.
you'd write a few pages and it'd be a bit rubbish, and it'd be the outline of something, and you'd be testing something, and I'd be thinking, oh, you're such a crap writer. This is just rubbish. You can't write this play. And actually, what I've realised, and this is where Holman and his idea of doodling comes in, is that there's kind of a bit of a pre-writing where I'm starting to try and have a go at what the beginning might look like, or Do you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
normally having repeated attempts at the beginning of the play, and
Yeah.
I sort of know I'm not really doing it yet,
Yeah.
but it's almost like warming up maybe or something like that. I don't know. So I'm doing that. Um, I'm thinking a lot, doing other stuff as well. Um, I think that there's a kind of question to do with bandwidth as well, which is like, I might, I've written a new play and an adaptation this in the last kind of year or so, and in the last year or so, I've also written quite a lot of telly. And although you're kind of getting on with the telly, I still say there's about 5% of my bandwidth. Do you know what I mean? That's on
Yeah.
the play.
Yeah. Yeah. On the back burner kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And then, when you're in the shower one morning, you're not thinking about the fourth draft of the telly. You're thinking about
Yeah.
that book you're writing a play from, or the new play that you're writing, or whatever it is. For some reason, the shower is a good place for me. It's like I get ideas in the shower.
Yeah.
In Basel, it's a lot like that. Which is weird. I don't know why, but
And do you keep a notebook, or do you kind of keep a file on the computer or something that you're adding to, or is it more kept in your head?
no, I keep an actual old-fashioned file.
Right. Oh, right.
Uh,
Okay.
and I normally use the combination of an old file or folder, like a box file or a plastic wallet type thing,
Right.
which becomes allotted for a project. You normally kind of graduate to a box file when there's too much stuff to sit in a plastic folder without spilling it everywhere all the time.
Huh.
So there's a folder and there's notebooks, so you get ridiculous things like you'll get a box file that I've opened on a project, and there's bits of paper with notes and scraps of this and that, and then about 3 different small notebooks that are shoved in there as well, that have
Okay.
all got, and like anyone's notebooks, like any writer's notebook, I guess, then you'll look in these notebooks and there's notes on the first preview of beginning, there's a shopping list. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's there's the play, and like if you have time off of a project, or I do, and then you come back to it and you think, is this the right notebook? Why is this in here? This just seems to have a
Yeah.
sort of a Sainsbury's weekly shop on it, or a kind of list of Christmas presents I need to buy, and then you suddenly flick through it and think, oh
Yeah.
yeah, it's this notebook.
So is that? I mean, that's really interesting to me because I keep a notebook, I keep a file on my computer, and I add stuff, and I always
Yeah,
think there's lots in there, but very often when I get to that point where I think I'm actually going to start writing, I'm often disappointed by how little I've got, um, and how actually most of it has actually happened up here, and it's just sort of evolved, and the scraps and things are actually a bit like, well, I'm not going to use any of this stuff, but maybe I needed to get it out. Have you actually accumulated a lot of stuff that will go into the play or not?
yeah, I think it's a fair amount. There's a lot of waste. What you say strikes a chord with me. Like I think it's funny when you look over that stuff and you don't understand what you meant,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
or why something like, or sometimes I'll write an idea and I'll give it a double tick or an asterisk to somehow remind myself that it's an important idea, and then you look at it like trying to think, what on earth does it mean? I don't even know what it means. This idea. So I suppose the thing is as I get older, I worry. I've always maintained that you don't forget the really important stuff, and it gestates away, and it's, whether it's your thing of it being on the back burner or my thing of a little bit of your bandwidth on it. I, you know, and generally that's held true, but I somehow keep thinking, oh, well, maybe when I'm 47 or maybe when I'm 48, I'm just going to start losing this stuff more. Maybe I need to take this stuff more seriously of keeping notes. But so far, it's sort of held up a bit anyway.
And you've talked about this. There's the sort of pre-writing doodling moment where you're
Yes.
kind of limbering up, or you're seeing what angle to approach it from, or something like that, that you're casing the joint. But
Yeah.
when you actually start writing, do
Yeah.
you tend to write in a very intense burst? Actually, it sounds to me like you've already said that Knot of the Heart took a month or so for each half. I think you said the same about in Basildon, that you wrote an act a week. Is that pretty sort of standard, that a play would take a month or so?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that I think that most first drafts of plays
Right.
um, are are done in a fairly focused and concentrated period, and I think that's partly because there's something about um, the that I think one of the many things that you're trying to do as a playwright is you're trying to write a text which is essentially a blueprint for dramatic action
Yeah.
and for bodies in motion, and it's something that's got to have some kind of momentum, you know.
Hmm.
And it's also in a play you're trying to write something that can exist on the moment for an audience and for the performers in unison, you know. And so you want, I think, to try and have some of that sense of uh, you know, you need, however much homework you've done and however much research or planning or however you want to describe that part of the work and job, I think also you have to kind of trust that that's there a bit as well and go for it a bit, so that the work has the quality of being on the moment a bit as well, you know. And I think you have to really trust having good ideas as you do stuff, you know.
Right.
So I think kind of cracking on a bit um, is really important. Now, there have been exceptions to that, because where sometimes where the form of the play or the story itself is big and complicated in some way, and a play, it's sort of silly to try and write the play in that way. You know, it doesn't help. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
There's more
Yeah.
loss than gain. So I think shows like Market Boy and Holy Warriors, or plays like Incomplete and Random Acts of Kindness that we've talked about already,
Mm.
they were kind of written in a kind of a more measured and drawn out way, but that was partly because they were so complicated. It was so complicated trying to find out what they were and to put them together, actually,
Yeah.
you know.
Right. And in terms of planning, um, uh, you've said actually that you will plan. What is a David Eldridge plan? What do you have before you start writing? The In what way are you mapping out the play? Is it structural? Is it, or what?
Well, I think it's structural, and it's also making sure that in terms of the story that I'm telling, that there's enough drama. You know, there are just literally enough things happening in the present tense.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, as I'm increasingly getting on, as we all are, I'm sort of realizing this isn't a recent innovation anymore, and I've been doing this for 20 odd years now.
Mm.
But like after the first few plays, I sort of decided that um, it was probably around the time when I wrote Under the Blue Sky. I think Under the Blue Sky was the first play that I tried to write a bit like it. Well, certainly the first act of Under the Blue Sky I did like this, which is I kind of think that, well, I remember at university, Peter Thompson, the great Peter Thompson, gave a lecture that had this observation that Granville Barker thought that something had to happen in a play, at least one thing had to happen every 10 minutes. And I remember even as a 20-year-old thinking, God, what a boring play if you only get one thing happening every 10 minutes. And for some reason, like after, you know, I'd written a few plays, and a few years after university, so I suppose around 1999, when I was trying to write Under the Blue Sky properly, I remember sort of thinking like, what well, how many things do need to happen in a play, or what's the minimum? And I remember thinking that probably a modern audience's attention span was maybe more like a pop song or an ad break rather than Gravel Barker's every 10 minutes. And then I sort of thought, well, maybe something roughly has got to happen every 3 minutes.
Mm.
And like, this is bananas, really, Dan. I know this, but it's a way of me beginning to organise my thoughts and ideas and story. You know, so I'm working on the time span of a play and the shape of a play, but also like in terms of the dramatic action. I know what story I want to tell, but how is it told dramatically, that story? You know, what are the things that happen on stage? And you know, it's useful for me to think, well, the first act of Basildon is roughly half an hour long. You
Yeah.
know, I reckon at least 10 things have got to happen here. Now, of course, of course, the first act of In Basildon doesn't revolve around 10 key plot points or 10 key action points. But when I'm starting to do that work, it's a way of trying to sort of organize the material a bit. Do you know
Mm.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And you chuck it out of the window because you realise actually there are 13 important things that happen in the first act of
Yeah.
this
Sure.
play. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's just a way of not beginning in complete chaos,
Yeah.
you know?
And you
So
once described when I think another occasion when we were talking about beginning, which we're going to talk about a bit more in a moment, but you once described to me when I asked you this question about how structured was it, I think you said there was a series of events that were, I think your phrase was, they were like tent poles.
yeah,
Um, and which makes a lot of sense given what you've just been saying. And I wonder whether when you say things happening, you're not presumably meaning a sort of major plot point. It might be they tidy up the room together or something, which doesn't necessarily advance the plot as such. It's not a twist or a revelation, but it might be, you know, or they dance or something. It might be just a thing that happens that's something for the audience.
well, yeah, I sort of yes and no. I mean, I don't. I think it's not entirely relevant to beginning, just because I didn't I wanted it to feel absolutely real.
Yeah.
I didn't pre-plot beginning in that way. I knew that there were these big things that happened that were like the tent poles. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
as you say, and that I was kind of just trying to get to that moment because I wanted it to feel absolutely real, uh, and so I had to feel my way with it, you know. So I didn't entirely write it in that.
Right.
I didn't kind of plan quite so much on that play.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I don't like. I don't. I know you don't mean it like this, but I think that those things actually in beginning that you've alluded to, they were really important actually in terms of the story because to me the tidying up is like
Yeah.
for her is like I'd rather tidy up than kiss you. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, and for him, it's like an avoidance. So actually, they're quite big things in terms of the characters. Or the dancing, you know, that's when she thinks he's finally going to kiss her.
Yeah.
And he kind of gets fairly close to it during Bros. I mean, certainly in the NT first production. Um, but then doesn't quite loses his nerve, you know, then the moment's gone, you know. So so I never I suppose it's what I always am trying to write dramatic action rather than mere action. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
just something happens on stage, there's got to be something at stake. You know?
And it's also really interesting what you say that there's a balance there between structuring it, but also because it's a play, having to kind of be in the moment, allowing things to happen. Do you know what I mean? There's a sort of
Yeah,
structured bit and there's an improvisational bit to the writing. And
yeah,
I guess that kind of what you're saying is that a play like Beginning, maybe the balance is a bit more towards the improvisational, whereas Incomplete Random Acts, of course, is probably much more towards the structural. Have you ever got that balance wrong and tried to write a play and over-structured it or not structured it enough? Or
I don't know, actually. I think other people would probably have to make judgments about that. I don't know how reliable. I feel that there's a play of mine that I think that's overwrought, in the sense that I kind of got rid of too many of the kind of wrinkles through rewriting it. It's kind of, well, it's no point sort of trying to cut. It's like a play I did MAD for the Bush. Yeah. And there's lots of stuff that I think is great about the play. Don't get me wrong. I'm not ashamed of the play in any way. I'm really take pride in that play and the work we did. But I think that it was a really interesting example of there being, like, the first draft that the Bush committed to. Mm-hmm. You know, it's really strong, you know, and there was stuff in it that wasn't quite right with the storytelling, but there was something that was so emotionally true about that first draft, you know?
Yeah.
And somehow when we kind of fixed the problems in a way, you know what I mean, in terms of storytelling, it lost some of that core of what it was that was striking somehow and true somehow. And you know, and that was really interesting. I mean, it's a good question. I'm a bit flummoxed. I'd love to be able to answer it. It feels as well like a bit of a strange one for me to answer. It feels like more like you and Sarah Grahala and other people who take an interest in my work should talk about that, really, well, you know.
Actually, I want to ask you a bit about rewriting in a moment, because I'm just going to ask you a couple of really nuts and bolts questions. About,
whatever.
Do you handwrite or type your plays?
I type. Yeah, I type, but I print off all the time. I mean, I'm a nightmare for the environmentalists because I'm just printing off all day long and then wandering around with a red pen saying it out loud.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, this is where this video gets so nerdy. What is the David Eldridge font?
Pardon? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
What font do you write your plays in?
Times New Roman.
Okay. Has that always been the case? Did you choose that?
Yeah, I think it was because, like, of I mean, I don't know if they are, but like, it's just because of the fonts that you see in published plays.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So I remember thinking that I wanted my play scripts to look vaguely like they do in a kind of a Methuen or Nick Hearn kind of edition. And it's also good because there's a differentiation between the screenplays that are all in Courier that are done on final draft, you know, on a final draft template. So it's good that in terms of the font, that's a play and that's a screenplay, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Writer's block. Have you ever had it?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I mean, I think during 1999, I had a good best part of a year where I really lost my way.
Right.
Like, I don't know. You know, I think, you know, I'd had a big hit when I was 22 at the Bush with Serving It Up. You know, and it was a play that really I just had written at uni. I kind of wrote it to wind up my mates. My biggest aspiration for it was to try and go to the NSTF with it, or to win the International Student Playwriting Competition. I certainly entered for it, even if I didn't think it would be a prize winner. And then for, you know, 6 months after I graduated, it went on at the Bush and it was a big success. I suddenly was kind of a professional writer, and I kind of I just sort of did it by default, really, because everyone said I should, and I enjoyed writing, you know, and it was something I could do, and I was being paid to write. But I didn't think about it much beyond that. But I think you know, the next, I think, 3 plays went okay. Nothing was really bad, but nothing shone quite as brightly as Serving It Up did. And I think, you know, inevitably there was going to be a period where I had to have the serious conversation with myself about whether I really wanted to do this, you know,
Right.
and whether I really wanted to do this forever, and whether there were other things that I would enjoy doing, you know,
Yeah.
as well as writing,
Yeah.
not necessarily even just giving up writing, but just, and I think so there was a bit of self-reflection and self-doubt, and I just found it hard to write. You know, I just found it hard. I found it really hard to write, and it was only sort of you know, sort of July, August time, I think, when I bumped into Jack Bradley one day. Just, I can't even remember where I bumped into him. It might have been down in the South Bank somewhere, and I'd not seen him for ages. And I don't know what
He
I
would
was
have
doing
been
down
he would have been literary manager of the National Theatre at the time. Is that right?
there. Yeah, yeah, he was still literary manager of the National Theatre,
Yeah.
and we stopped, like, it must have been in the afternoon because or late afternoon, because we stopped and had a beer. He said, "Oh, do you fancy a pint?" So I went, "Okay." And and he's sort of like, you know, he said, "Oh, how are you? I've not seen you for ages." And I said, "Oh, I'm thinking about giving up writing." And he's like, "What?" Like, and we just had a real chat about stuff, you know. And I just also, I think at the time I was completely skint. And I just was at that point where I was thinking, like, I'm still like living at my mum and dad's. Like, I'm 25, I'm still living at my mum and dad's.
Mm.
I'm like, you know, I can't afford to do anything. Like, I can't write. This is really hard work.
Mm.
And do I want to do this? Like, am I really any good at this? And Jack, um, I don't know. He was just nice. We ended up having about 3 pints that he bought, uh, or the National Theatre bought, I guess. And he said, "Oh well, let's keep in touch," you know. And then the following morning, Sue Higginson, who was the head of the National Studio, rang me and said, she said, "I know you're not doing anything next week, especially because I've spoken to Jack this morning. Come to the studio on attachment for 8 weeks. And it doesn't matter if you don't write anything, just come here."
Gosh.
And it was amazing. And, you know, I did write down, I did the first draft of Under the Blue Sky.
Wow.
So it was great, yeah. I've had little bits of block along the way, but it's
Yeah.
never been as serious as that, you know?
In terms of how you get over the little moments of writer's block, because everyone's had that evening or that day
Yeah.
where you go, everything I'm writing is rubbish. Who am I kidding? I can't do this. How do you get through that and stop it becoming a kind of a longer term block? Because obviously not everyone can go, I will check myself into the National Theatre studio for 8 weeks. So there's got to be a more
Yeah, yeah,
personal
yeah.
element
Well, I mean, you know, since then it's become part of my writing life, really, which is I just try not to give a fuck about it.
to
Like, I mean that seriously, because the more you get neurotic about it, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
So what I try and do is I just try and make sure that I do something productive with the day.
Right.
You know what I mean? You know, like if it's a bad writing day or a bad writing couple of days, then I try and put myself into something else productive. Now, because for the last few years I've had another part of my working life as a part-time lecturer at Birkbeck.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? In creative writing. That's really good in terms of having a crap couple of days on the writing, because during term time, there's always, you know, my commitment to Birkbeck that, you know, can occupy me. Do you know what I mean? So there's the teaching commitments and the meetings and marking deadlines that are hard in terms of Birkbeck, you know. But there is kind of the softer things, like I do part-time admissions. So if I have 2 crap days on a play or a screenplay, I'm going to go, right, tomorrow I'm going to get all my admissions house in order. Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
and then, you know, just take myself away from the writing, and then I normally come back to it thinking, oh yeah, I've got an idea about that, and I can move forwards. In terms of like the more granular level of block at home, I just break things down, Dan. So it's like I'm going to write for an hour, and then I'm going to have a chocolate biscuit. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's all about treats. I'm going to do this bit on the screenplay, and then I'm going to permit myself at lunchtime a game of FIFA on the PS4. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to ring my mate and have a laugh. You know, like it's ridiculous, but it's actually a really good way for me that I've discovered over the years of overcoming block. You know, because if I think, even after all these years of writing, 25 years now, if I think all I'm doing today is writing, that's really scary.
Mm.
You know, particularly if you know the bar that I set for myself is so high, you know, all the time, that it's got to be good.
Mm.
But it's really scary to think I've got to do a really good day's work if I think of it like that. Whereas if I think I'm just going to do this for half an hour and try and make sure that I crack this or that it's going to be good,
Mm.
and then I get to take myself away from that for 5 or 10 minutes,
Yeah.
then like it all feels much more manageable, you know, and it means that I tend not to get into those cycles of feeling blocked and then feeling crap about being blocked, which makes you even more blocked, you know.
Yeah, of course.
You know, I don't always manage to swerve them, you know, like I think if I'm down or upset about anything else that's going on in my life, that can affect my writing, you know. I'm not someone who can, you know, when I got divorced, for example, a few years ago, that wasn't always the greatest year or so. Do you know what I mean? For
Yeah.
writing, you know.
Right.
But you know, my mum was ill in October. My mum was really ill, and you know, with the best will in the world, that just wasn't a great time, October, to write. You
Yeah.
know, it just
Yeah.
wasn't. You know,
Of course.
hospital, and you know, you can't. You know.
Um, can I ask you about rewriting? Because you
Yeah.
talked a little bit about that in relation to MAD, but of course, you know, all plays have to have a bit of rewriting. Do you find rewriting pleasurable, difficult? How do you approach the task of rewriting a play?
Well, normally it's a bit of a to-do list, you know, and there's normally someone else's to-do list, a director or a literary manager or an artistic director in a theatre or in telly,
Hmm.
you know, an exec producer, a broadcaster, a
Yeah.
script editor, sometimes a consultant, you know, like I'm working on a legal show, I've worked on a medical show, I've
Right.
worked with a police consultant on a show. So everyone's got their to-do list and I've got my to-do list. And you know, I tend to go through it in quite a practical way,
Mhm.
and I tend to really enjoy it.
Right.
And again, I think it's I used to hate rewriting when I was starting out, but over the years I really enjoy it. I find it really pleasurable getting something right
Mm.
and trying to perfect something,
Yeah.
and particularly when you know it's going to have an emotional effect on an audience, you know, to make an audience laugh or really enthrall an audience or move an audience. I really get a kick out of perfecting something and getting it right. But I tend to kind of start off with the biggest notes and then work my way down the list to the minor stuff, you know,
Right.
and that's all really good. I think the thing that I find most challenging about rewriting is trying to refine something emotionally, to
Yeah.
reconnect emotionally with it. That's one of the things that I've been struggling with in the last week or so, to be honest, with one of these TV jobs. Is like I was in such a strong emotional place with something before Easter,
Mm.
and I feel like emotionally I've lost my thread a bit.
Yeah.
Like from an objective point of view, like I know what all the fixes are in terms of the storytelling and the drama, but emotionally it doesn't. I'm not feeling it, you know.
Yeah.
And I think you do need to feel it when you write for actors and audiences.
Just about beginning then, because since we're already kind of talking about it, I want to ask you
Yeah.
about the characters. I want to ask you about the characters because I kind of think one of the things I always think is very distinctive about your writing is there's a kind of incredible integrity to the characters, that they feel like all your characters have always been fully imagined. That's what it feels like anyway. They feel
Mm.
very, very 360-degree. I could walk all the way around them, even when I'm reading them. Uh, how far do you know your characters before you start writing the play? How far do they emerge through the play? Do you kind of build up dossiers about your characters ever?
I tend not to build up like dossiers about the characters particularly. I do tend to do some character work beforehand. I mean, I think their jobs and their family histories,
Mm.
and sometimes like relationship histories are things that I sort of uh, think about and devise and work out. And some of that stuff ends up in the play, and some of it doesn't. It's just there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the play, and I tend to try and sort of have a sense of what their actions are, so what they're doing. So, so I suppose this is quite a key point, really, which is that I sometimes know what their actions are and not their motivations. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I discover what their motivations are through the doing myself.
Mm.
And it means somehow that the characters can surprise me a bit. They can be a bit different. Like, so for example, with Laura in beginning, you know, like like her wit, the way that her wit emerged just through the writing of the play wasn't something I'd thought about. Like I'd sort of thought beforehand that Danny was the kind of crap joke guy. Do you know what I mean? That has a bit of charm in the self-consciously crap joke. I hadn't particularly thought much about Laura's wit. It wasn't that I thought that she didn't have one. I just didn't think about that. It was something that emerged through the writing.
Yeah.
The kind of sharpness of it somehow, and all of that. And so that was a really nice discovery, in terms of the characterization through the doing, through the writing, really.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I think that's probably the most kind of significant thing I can say is that I think a lot about the character's actions, um, and then that seems to be a kind of a gateway into people being complicated because I try not to reduce them to their motivations before they're even alive,
Yeah.
because like this can happen sometimes as a teacher of writing, and I'm sure you're familiar with this as well, Dan, that sometimes when students do that thing of going, well, what does the character want and what's the obstacle, their focus can be so much on that they end up writing a two-dimensional or one-dimensional character because all the character is trying to get that thing they want.
Mm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And of course, I think about what my characters want all the time, moment to moment, as well as over the course of the whole play. But I try not to kind of to weigh them down with just the baggage of their objectives.
Mm.
I just try and think about what they're doing in tandem with what they want, and that seems to be a route into getting something maybe a bit more, that feels real, you know. And I mean, it is so important to me, though, this thing of writing as well. I have it in my mind all the time, even if I don't know who the actors should be, that I am writing for actors, and it has to live on an actor's breath, and it has to go at the speed of an actor's thought. And I'm sure I've said this to you before over the years, Dan, or with your students, you know, that the thing that I heard of years ago in a documentary about John Galliano, that the reason why he was such a good designer was that he designed for a body in motion, not a mannequin, you know. And so designing for a body in motion feels like a really good way of describing playwriting, you know. And
Yeah.
and that for me is you know, like I said, you know, we talked about me being bad for the environment, you know. I am, you know, but that's what I'm doing all day, is I'm printing off these pages and then wandering around my office at Birkbeck, which is not that big, or the flat here in Haringey, with a red pen, acting out my own play or screenplay like a madman, you know. And but it's about it all being alive, you know, in some way, you know.
And
Yeah,
another thing I kind of want to talk about pace, actually, because this is a real-time play, and it's a sort of a slow burn in the sense that you have to get from A to Z in the kind of hour and a half. You don't want to rush it. You don't want to kind of, it can't be too low a burn. How did you kind of figure out the pacing of it?
I don't know, mate, to be honest. I mean, all I tried to do was just with that play, like, because I wanted it to be done in a completely real way. I mean, the play isn't entirely naturalistic because, you know, I mean, one of the first things that I started off with, I'm going to come back to your question, Dan. It's a little bit of a digression, I know this, but I am coming back to it. I started out with this kind of thinking about post-war German naturalism and Croats and all of that, and how wonderful those plays are, but that there aren't that many jokes. Do you know what I mean? And you sort of, you know, you sort of hear legendary stories about those productions in translation at the Bush and the Court and the RSC in the 80s and all of that, you know. And testing is a word sometimes that's used, you know, in there about their brilliance and austere naturalism. And so I sort of thought, well, I want to try and get some of, you know, that the commitment to that gesture of naturalism, but also, you know, some of what happens in real rooms in English theatre is often a lot funnier, you know. And you know, the comedy that comes out of embarrassment and awkwardness in reality, you know.
Yeah.
And so although I knew that there are two kind of almost theatre worlds coming together that I was interested in, one that's a bit more self-consciously theatrical than the other in a sense. So if you think of all of the physical comedy that there is in the first half an hour of beginning, you know, and that's all written by me. All those stage directions were written by me. They weren't put in afterwards. You know, they were all written by me, all the physical comedy. The play still had to be done in a really, needed to be able to be done in a way that felt entirely real. Now, coming back to your question and the pacing, when I wrote the play, I realised that for it to feel real as possible, I had to feel my way with the play much more than anything else I'd ever done before. And so it really was about, I've just got to try and get to this canastella. Do you know what I mean? I've got to get to the canastella. That's all I'm going to think about. I don't quite know how I'm going to get there, but I'm going to try and get to the canastella. Or later on in the play, I'm going to get to the point where Danny gets to looking at her letters on top of the sideboard, and he says what her name is, and they get to where they talk about what their families her family's like, because we'd got a sense of what his family's like, that they'd not gone there with her family at all, you know. So really, it was more like that. So I was having to trust myself a lot more than I had done with anything I'd tried before, because it felt like every 10 pages was a leap in the dark. Do you know what I mean? A bit. I've just got to try and trust that I'm going to get to. I'm ovulating. You
Yeah.
know, I don't quite know how I'm going to get to. I'm
Yeah.
ovulating, but I'm going to try. I'm going to do my best, and that it's going to feel real. You know, that was all really.
Yeah.
Um,
And then emotion. I wanted to ask you about emotion, because it's another thing that shouldn't be that rare, but I kind of think the sincere, genuine representation of, or expression of deep emotion is something that is really, really, I think of with your plays a lot. um and beginning, of course, heads towards, it's a play about people dancing around emotions a bit for a long time, and then there's a
hmm,
moment when it's all out on the table. Do you know what I mean? And I
yeah,
wondered if whether I want to ask you a bigger question about why is that important to you, but also sort of what's it particularly doing in beginning. But actually, it's the bigger question I'm interested in. What's emotion for you in your playwriting?
well, it goes right back to the beginning of when I got into theatre. So I I got into theatre when I was 17, um, because um, at the school went to, I was a scholarship and assisted place boy at a private school. And the school where I went to, when you did your A levels, you had to not just do your A levels, you had to do a couple more GCSEs in the lower sixth, which was really annoying. And I didn't want to do economics, you know. But there was a new drama teacher at the school, and she was introducing a GCSE in drama, and I did that quite honestly because I thought that it might be a bit of a DOS. I'd never done any drama before, never been in a school play. My mate Simon Marsh was doing it, and he'd noticed that it was only him and two other girls. And so I said I'd do it. So there were two boys and two girls. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's true. And there were two things, which was that the drama teacher, Mrs. Pryor, got us to do improvisations, which I'd never had any experience of before. And although I wasn't very good at, and have never been a very good actor, I was quite a good improviser. And I suppose because what I was doing maybe was writing on my feet in the moment, you know, I was quite good at what comes next, or a good twist or turn or effect in an improvisation. And quite early on, I did this improvisation of this guy killing himself, and 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 Mrs. Pryor and the three other sixth formers were sort of. I, I was looking at them as at the end of the improv, and they were sort of all silent and completely stunned, and they couldn't believe that all this is me. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And I couldn't quite believe that I had the thing of thinking, how on earth have I had that effect on them? You
Mm.
know? And so it was it's the kind of strong meat, you know, that I really like to get into that affects people. And the other thing, Dan, is that we went around the same time, and I've told this story so many times, but it's true and so important to me. I went and saw the first ever play that I'd seen. I'd never ever been to the theatre to see um, a proper play until I went on a sixth form theatre trip to see King Lear at the Barbican, which was the John Wood King Lear, directed by Nick Heitner.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe how powerful it was. I was totally engrossed, and most of all, the end. Because I'd not read King Lear yet, I didn't realise at the end when King Lear went off to get Cordelia. I expected they'd come back hand in hand, And when it came back on and she was dead, and it was how, I was absolutely devastated. And the impact in the theatre, the Barbican Theatre, of that devastating ending, the full force of the tragedy, I suppose, of King Lear, there, it really affected me. And I think I think it's really true that as an artist and as a writer, you want to somehow read the powerful effects that other works of art or people that have had on you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I've never ever forgotten the power of that King Lear. And I remember a couple of years later coming across a thing that John Osborne said, which was that he wanted to give audiences lessons in feeling. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to make people feel things. I want people to feel strong emotions. I want to move people's hearts. I really want to make people, I mean, it's such a cliche over the entertainment business, but I really do want to make people laugh and cry and have big experiences. And, you know, um, of course, the theatre is a place that's full of ideas and challenge and philosophy. Um, but I personally think that the way that you really affect audiences and the way that you affect and change audiences and people is by having some kind of emotional impact, you know, first and foremost. And that's what I try to do, and that's what I'm interested in. And I think with beginning, um, it's kind of all feeling, you know. It's sort of all feeling beginning, in a way, and in a way, the form of the play allows me to kind of explore that in a really concentrated way, because while they're suppressing one kind of feeling, they're articulating another kind of feeling, aren't they? Which is, does he really like me? Does she really like me? I'm scared to kiss her, which we all understand. So while one feeling is sat on, another feeling is articulated, I think, really clearly, or I hope it is.
Yeah.
Um, that's what I really try to do. I think more than anything, it's not the only thing that I do, but it's the most important thing to me. I think. Yeah, lessons in feeling is a good one.
And last question, and this is a question I'm asking everybody, and it's a very blunt sort of question. Uh, you've been writing for 25 years or so. What have you learnt?
Yeah. What have I learned?
Yeah.
Um, I think that I've learned to um, to never ever think that writing is the most important thing, because I think that the minute you think that writing is more important than anything, I think that you write less well. Um, for me, writing is about is about the human condition, and it's about telling stories about people that give us insights into the way that people are the way they are, and also the way that the world might work in one way or another. Um, and if if we if as a writer you start to think that writing's all important and that you're a person that's got the answers to some of these things, that somehow the gesture of writing and the gesture of being a writer is all important and self-important, then I think that you become less open to seeing and responding to the world as you find it.
Yeah.
Um, and that's always been a thing that's really important to me, is to speak as I find. Do you know what I mean? And now there are lots of writers, many writers who I love, who write the world as they would like it to be. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think I write the world as I would like it to be. I tend to try and write the world as I find it a bit. It's not a denial of romance, that. it's just I try and write it. So I think, just going, well, actually, when we were talking about the block earlier, the most important thing with block is to go, I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm going to do something else. Like, writing has to be the most important thing and the most unimportant thing in the world at the same time. To me, to write well, it's that dreaded word that's somehow associated, with Sir David Hare sometimes, of insouciance. But I think insouciance is a good
Right.
a good quality for a playwright. A slightly devil-may-care attitude along the way, that it's all important and not important at all. And I feel at a peace with theatre and its sort of its ephemeral nature as well. That it's there and it's gone. I mean, I always think the sharpest rebuke and reminder of one's mortality as a playwright is when you go to the theatre for the first time, to a theatre that's had your play on in it.
Yeah.
And it is like that feeling of, like, to me, it's like that feeling of seeing a woman that I really, really maybe have been in love with some other guy. And it's just like, you go, you suddenly remember it's not all about you. Do you know what I mean? The world goes on,
That is
So I think it's sort of.
that
Go
is
on, Dan, sorry.
that is a perfect place to end. We cannot do better than that. David, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and your wisdom. It's been brilliant talking to you. I look forward to this all being over. I love your T-shirt. And I will see you when the lockdown is over. All right.
You will.
Thank
Really
you.
enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.